All right, today we're going to dive into a pretty foundational topic in theology, the attributes of God. And we're going to kick things off with a question that, it seems simple enough, but as you're about to see, the answer is anything but. So let me just ask you straight up, how many attributes does God have? It sounds like a question that should have a simple number as an answer, right? Like, can you just list them out, count them up, and say, there, that's the number? Is there some definitive list everyone agrees on? Well, the short answer to that is not really. The truth is, it's way more complicated than you might think. Theologians and philosophers have been debating this for centuries, and honestly, there is no single universally accepted number. But the reason why they disagree, now that's what's really fascinating. So why all the disagreement? Well, it really boils down to a few key things. First off, some of the historical lists out there were never meant to be the whole shebang. They weren't trying to be comprehensive. Then you've got people combining concepts. For example, is God's all-knowing nature, omniscience, the same thing as his wisdom, or are those two separate attributes? Then we get into even deeper water. Is something like mercy an essential part of God's nature, or is it an activity God does for his creation? And finally, and this is a big one, there's a disagreement over what's an attribute versus what's a characteristic. Okay, so if getting a perfect count is off the table, what do? Well, we can categorize them. Instead of just making a long, jumbled list, we can build a framework. And this helps us get a much clearer picture of the different facets of God's nature. So let's start with what are called the non-moral or metaphysical attributes. Now, these aren't about right and wrong. They're about the fundamental nature of God's being, the what of God, you could say. You'll see some familiar ones here, like omnipotence, being all-powerful, and immutability, the idea that God is unchanging. But there are also more complex ones, like aseity, which is a fancy word that just means God is completely self-existent. He doesn't depend on anything or anyone else. These attributes, they describe God's very essence, completely independent of his creation. And then we've got the moral attributes. These are all about God's character and his perfect moral nature. This is the who of God. Here we find attributes like holiness, justice, and goodness. These are absolutely essential to who God is. They define his perfect moral compass. And this is where that distinction we mentioned earlier really clicks into place. See, an attribute, like holiness, is intrinsic to God. It's part of his very being. God is holy. But a characteristic, well, that describes how God relates to us, to his creation. For instance, God's sovereignty requires something to be sovereign over. His mercy needs creatures to be merciful to. So here's the bottom line. Attributes are what God is in himself, while characteristics describe God in relation to others. Okay, so this whole system of categorization, it's helpful, but it naturally leads us to an even deeper, almost mind-bending question. We've been throwing around words like omnipotence, goodness, and justice. But what do these words invented by finite human beings, even mean when we try to apply them to an infinite being? That is a huge philosophical hurdle. I mean, really think about it for a second. Our entire language, every word we have, is built from our limited, finite, created experiences. So how in the world can we use these same words to accurately describe a being who is infinite, uncreated, and just completely beyond our full understanding? This is like the central challenge of all theology. How do we talk about God without just shrinking him down to our own size? Well, according to classical philosophy, there are really only three ways we can even attempt to do this. We can speak univocally, equivocally, or analogically. So let's break down what each of these means, because two of them are basically philosophical dead ends, and only one of them gives us a viable path forward. Right, so before we find the solution, let's take a look at what doesn't work. Because by understanding why the first two options just completely fall apart, we'll see exactly why that third option is so incredibly necessary. First up is the univocal approach. This idea says that a word like good means the exact same thing when we're talking about a person and when we're talking about God. But that's just impossible, right? It either shrinks the infinite God down to our finite level, or it wrongly puffs us up to an infinite one. So that's out. Then you've got the equivocal view. This one says that good means something entirely different for God than it does for us. But if that's true, if God's goodness has zero connection to our understanding of goodness, then the word becomes totally meaningless. We can't actually say anything true about God at all. So, since speaking univocally is impossible, and speaking equivocally just leads to skepticism, we are left with only one logical choice. This is the path that lets us use meaningful language about God, but with a whole lot of humility. So, this is the crucial takeaway. All proper statements we make about God, all those attributes we listed earlier, they have to be understood as analogies. And this isn't some sort of weak compromise. It's the only way our finite language can meaningfully point towards an infinite reality without breaking. So what does that actually look like? Well, speaking by analogy or analogical predication means that our words are similar, but they're not identical. Think of it like this. When we say a person is good, we're seeing a faint echo of the ultimate, perfect, infinite goodness that is God. Our human goodness comes from and points back to God's goodness, which is the original source. So the words are connected, they have real meaning, but there is still an infinite gap between the two. And that kind of leaves us with a final thought to chew on. We started this journey by trying to count attributes, then we moved to categorizing them, and now we're questioning the very words we're using. Realizing that our language about God is fundamentally analogical doesn't make it meaningless, just the opposite. It preserves the profound mystery of it all. It allows us to speak truthfully while at the same time admitting that the reality we're trying to describe will always, always be infinitely greater than our words can ever hope to contain.